Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Andy Woods, and he's been here a lot of times, and he's a great scholar, and I guess God does save one or two lawyers as well, just to show the greatness of His grace. And Andy is a pastor of Sugarland Bible Church and also at the Houston, I never get that right. What's it?
College of Biblical Studies.
College of Biblical Studies in Houston as well. He's a professor. And he's going to be talking about world government on the horizon. And as we're talking in the last hour, globalism is one of those things that you just see, especially in the last 100 years. That's how the world thinks it can solve the problem somehow. So, Andy, come on and let her rip, Tater Chip.
All right, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. If we could take our Bibles and open them to Genesis 11 and verse 1. As Tommy indicated, the title of this session is World Government on the Horizon. And in this conference, we're sort of focusing on current events that are potentially setting the stage for the tribulation period. And one of the events or trends that I think is very clear is this whole subject of globalism or world government. It's a big topic, but I'd like to hit it in 4 parts if I could. Number 1, I want to look at the divine perspective on globalism. And we're going to see that God has expressed an opinion on the subject. Number 2, we want to look at Satan's goal of instituting globalism. And then number 3, we want to look at some stage-setting events. These aren't, as we learned in the prior session, fulfillments of prophecy, but they are stage-setting events that are preparing the way for the fulfillment of prophecy. And I have to warn you that when we get to number 3 there, you're going to be very depressed, because I was depressed putting all this stuff together. So hopefully with Roman numeral 4, we'll end on a positive note. I promise not to make this the world has gone to hell in a handbasket type of presentation, but you'll see that there's actually a silver lining in the whole thing. So let's go ahead and start with the divine perspective on globalism. Does God have an opinion? And that's why I had you turn to Genesis 11, verses 1 through 9, really. This is the very familiar story that we all learned in Sunday school as kids about the famous Tower of Babel, or Babel. Depends on which syllable gets the emphasis, however you pronounce that. But it says, now the whole world used the same language and the same words, and it came about as they journeyed east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. They said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. And they said, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name, otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have the same language, and this is what they began to do, and now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the languages of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the entire earth. What we discover after the flood coming into existence at the dawn of human history is really man's first attempt at world government. This was probably the first United Nations conference in the history of mankind. And when we look at Genesis 10, verses 8 through 10, we learn that that system was coming together through a man named Nimrod. It's interesting to me that Nimrod's name actually means rebellion or revolt, because this was a rebellion or a revolt against God. It's a contradiction to the direct instructions of God. You remember what God said to this post-flood generation. In Genesis 9:1, He told them to scatter. And these people did the exact opposite, and they came together to build what we would call a New World Order, which is a one-world system of economics, politics, and religion, which excludes God and His viewpoint. And so we all know the story very well. God was upset with what was happening, and He came and intervened, and He performed a miracle through the creation of multiple languages. And consequently, the builders couldn't cooperate with each other, and this building project was stopped dead in its tracks. Why did God stop this project? I think the answer to it is in Genesis 11 and verse 6, where God says, "Now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them." Now, when it says nothing will be impossible for them, it's not talking about the potential for good. Rather, it's talking about the potential for evil. And if we think about it just for a moment, if only one government exists on planet Earth, and that government happens to fall into the wrong hands, then it's Katie bar the door. The potential for evil is unlimited. However, if you have multiple governments, multiple nations, it becomes almost impossible for evil to get control of everything. Because even if evil gets control of a government, there are other governments that can arise and oppose what is happening in that evil government. We saw that in World War II era with Adolf Hitler. We saw the Allies arise and oppose Hitler, preventing Nazism from spreading over the face of the whole earth. And so what God did here at this tower is He created multiple nations. And these multiple nations serve as a check and balance system. God understands something about human nature. In the post-flood world, this is something God said. He said the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. In other words, human nature is corrupted. And as Lord Acton said, all power tends to corrupt. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. So given the fallen nature of man, we don't want power centralized into one human being, because he will abuse that power given the defective and corrupted nature of humanity. And so consequently, in the post-flood world on, the natural ordering of God is through individual nations. This is something that God Himself has set up to curtail the influence of evil. And on that slide there, I have all of the verses I could find where God desires things to be ordered according to the individual nation state and not global government. I'll just draw your attention to one verse, Acts 17, verse 26. This is Paul's Mars Hill address, and it says this: "He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation." So this idea of borders, boundaries, different nation states, this is a God-ordained idea. And as you look at those passages sometime, we don't have time to go through all of them, but you'll see that this concept of nations even carries into the millennial kingdom. And, interestingly enough, this concept of different nations carries into the eternal state. So obviously what God established here at Babel was He set up a precedent related to how humanity is to be ordered from this point onward. And so this, when we study Genesis 11, we develop or we begin to discover that God has a very clear perspective on world government. This is the divine viewpoint on world government. God is against world government. So that takes us to Roman numeral 2. If God is against world government, then what is Satan's goal? It would be the opposite, right? Satan always works in history to do the opposite of what God has ordained and established. Satan's goal is to subvert the divine ordering of nations as established at Babel and bring control of the world back together under a single individual. So just as Satan, prior to the divine intervention of God, was ruling a man, Nimrod, and Nimrod was ruling the entire world on Satan's behalf, Satan's ambition has always been to get that system back. And we know that one day he will achieve that in the events of the Great Tribulation, where he will rule over a man, the beast or the Antichrist, and the Antichrist will govern the world on God's behalf. And consequently, when we understand the mind of Satan, we begin to understand where history is headed. According to our understanding of Bible prophecy, history is what we call linear. It's progressing somewhere. The events that are happening in our world are not random, they're not coincidental, they're not accidental, but they're progressing somewhere. And Satan, we believe, will achieve his goal in the events of the tribulation period. This is when these prophecies of world government will actually find their fulfillment. There are many, many verses that speak of this. One of them is Daniel 7 and verse 23. It's talking about the final form of Gentile rule that will exist just prior to the second advent of Jesus at the end of the tribulation period. Daniel said the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth. And then the verse says it will devour the whole earth. Revelation 13 and verse 7, it says, "And authority to the beast was given over every tribe and people and tongue and nation." Revelation 13 and verse 8 says, "All who dwell on the earth will worship him," that is the beast. And then finally, over in the book of Revelation, chapter 17 and verse 15, it talks about a harlot sitting on many waters. The harlot is the system of the Antichrist, and the waters are the people that the Antichrist system will influence. And Revelation 17 verse 15 says, "The waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues." So all of these passages tell us that prior to the return of Christ, there will exist on planet Earth what we would call a one world government, a new world order, whichever term you'd like to use. Change. Yeah, hope and change. One of the things that we have to understand about Satan is he is a great imitator of God. Isaiah 14 and verse 14, which I believe is a description of Satan's fall, it says this of Satan. Satan says, "I will make myself like the Most High." Satan, unlike your typical theologian today, understands prophecy very well, and he applies a literal hermeneutic to prophecy. And he well understands that God is going to rule over the last Adam, Jesus Christ, who will rule the world on God's behalf. And so since Satan is an imitator of God and God is going to have a coming kingdom upon the earth, Satan works in history to replicate or duplicate this. He today cannot quite pull it off because something is inhibiting him called the restrainer. We see a discussion of the restrainer in 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 6 and 7. Just to kind of make a long story short, I understand the restrainer as the work of the Holy Spirit through the church. In other words, as long as the church is present and as long as the Holy Spirit's restraining ministry is active, Satan will never be able to pull the pieces together to create the one world system that he wants. That's why there's such hatred in the world for the Christian as an explanation for that. But having said that, even before the rapture of the church, there, I believe, are significant inroads that Satan can make in not necessarily having these prophecies be fulfilled, but rather setting the stage. So this takes us into Roman numeral 3, where I'd like to talk through very briefly 10 stage-setting events that I believe are not the fulfillment of world government prophecy, but they are, in essence, preparing the way, paving the way for the coming one-world system of the future. And this is where the whole concept of prophetic stage setting becomes very significant. Did you know that the world was set up for the first coming of Christ? Galatians 4 and verse 4 says, "When the fullness of time came, God sent forth His Son." Jesus did not just make His entrance into our world at any time in history. The stage was set. And when we study intertestamental history, we learn that a lot of things were happening in the so-called silent years. I don't know if I like the name silent years because God was very active, although He wasn't speaking because the Old Testament canon was closed, but He was active setting the stage for the entrance of Jesus Christ. For example, through Hellenization and Alexander the Great, the Greek language came into place in the known world. So one of the richest dialects was in place to record the revelation of God's Son. And even beyond that, there was Pax Romana and Roman peace and universal Roman roads. And all of that stuff was set up ahead of time so that when the gospel came into existence through the incarnate Son of God, there would be the right circumstances in place for the rapid transmission of the gospel. Now, if the world can be set up for the first coming of Christ, why can't we say that the stage is being set up for the second coming of Christ? A basketball game, for example, doesn't just happen. You go watch a basketball game and the teams come out and they do layup drill and the referees take their positions on the court and the bleachers fill with stands and someone begins selling popcorn and you say to yourself, something's ready to start here in an athletic contest. So in the same way, the world, the way it's headed, is, I believe, being set up for the coming one world government of the future that the Antichrist will reign over. Now, I don't know how much longer the curtain will rise. I don't have any insight into that. But to me, the stage very clearly is being set in this direction of world government. And I'd like to, if I could, talk you through about 10 trends. Now, these trends are not exhaustive. You're probably going to say, well, you left this out and you left that out. But these are the things that I see just from my limited time frame. And these are things that are very significant to me as far as the way I think. Once again, these trends are not fulfillments of prophecy, but they're setting the stage for a fulfillment of prophecy of world government in the last days. So let me talk you through these trends. Number one, I would draw your attention to elite thinking. Now, when I say elite, what am I referring to? I'm talking about the movers and the shakers. I'm talking about not Mr. and Mrs. America. I'm talking about people who have influence in economics, politics, religion, and entertainment. And as you get into the mind of the elite, you start looking and reading some of the things they say and write, what you begin to discover is a globalist paradigm pervades the thinking of the elites. They do not think in national terms, they think in global terms. It even comes out in some of our entertainment. John Lennon sung about this, didn't he, in the song Imagine. He said, imagine a time where there will be no countries. Now that statement is a direct rebellion at what God set up at the Tower of Babel. No countries, no religion, no heaven, no hell, no possessions. Now I have to kind of chuckle at that one because when John Lennon died, he left an estate valued of about $250 million to his widow. So it's very interesting with these elites. They set up the rules for the rest of us, and they never seem to apply the rules to themselves. Everyone living for today, in other words, no such thing as God or accountability or Christianity, and the world is one. Here's a statement from a globalist named Henry Komager, and this is what he says. The inescapable fact, traumatized by the energy crisis, the population crisis, the armaments race, and so forth, is that nationalism, as we have noted in the 19th and much of the 20th century, is as much of an anachronism today as with states' rights, when Calhoun preached it and Jefferson Davis fought for it. Now, when you study the history of America, what you discover is our founding fathers gave to America the power was supposed to reside with the states. And what has happened over time is that power has been gradually given up to a massive national government on the theory that only a massive national government can resolve our national problems. Komager goes on and he says, just as we know or should know that none of our domestic problems can be solved within the artificial boundaries of the states, so none of our global problems can be solved largely within the boundaries of the nation. And so what he is saying is this same process needs to continue. Just as states gave up their rights to the national government, governments around the world need to give up their rights to a transnational government because that's the only way to solve our global problems. A global problem requires a global solution, see. So this is how the elites think. And people think, well, this is just conspiracy talk, crazy talk. But notice what David Rockefeller said in his memoirs. He said, for more than a century, ideological extremists have seized upon well-publicized incidents to attack the Rockefeller family for the inordinate influence they claim we wield over American political life and economic institutions. Some even believe that we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists and conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty. And I'm proud of it. It's interesting that as we get closer to this world government, the globalists themselves become more and more honest as to what they're actually trying to do. Now, most of us think that the Supreme Court kicked out of the American public schools religion in the 1960s. The fact of the matter is, the public schools today are more religious than they've ever been. The religion that's being promulgated is not the religion of Christianity, it's the religion of humanism. We have doctrinal statements by humanists called Humanist Manifesto 1, Humanist Manifesto 2, and Humanism 2000. And they lay out their beliefs in the form of a creed, much like you would find in your church. And this is one of the articles of Humanist Manifesto 2. It says, we deplore the division of humankind on nationalistic grounds. That's direct rebellion at what God established at Babel. We have reached a turning point in human history where the best option is to transcend the limits of national sovereignty and to move toward the building of a world community, a system of world law and world order based upon transnational federal government. There's a fascinating exchange that you can watch on YouTube between Jeff Sessions, the senator from Alabama, I believe, who's almost to me like one of the last men standing, and Leon Panetta, who was Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration. And this is a situation where the senator is questioning the secretary. And notice what it says. Sessions asked Panetta, if he could initiate a no-fly zone in Syria without congressional approval. Again, here's Panetta's answer. Again, our goal would be to seek international permission and we would come to Congress and inform you and determine how best to approach this, whether or not we would want to get the permission from Congress, Panetta said. Look at Sessions' response. I'm almost breathless about that, Sessions responded. What I heard you say is we were going to seek international approval, and then we'll come back and tell the Congress what we might do and how we might seek congressional approval. Panetta explained that if the U.S. forces are working as part of an international coalition, then the administration would want to get the appropriate permissions, which he said is something that all of these countries would want. Sessions pressed the issue and asked what entity the administration would seek permission from. Sessions said he was all in favor of international cooperation, but added he was baffled by the idea that somehow an international assembly would provide a legal basis for the deployment of the U.S. military. Sessions responded that the international bodies provide no legal authority to deploy U.S. military into combat operations. So you want to send the troops into harm's way. How do you do it? Well, the nationalist, Sessions says, you've got to have a declaration from our Congress. Panetta, the globalist, says you go out and you get world opinion. And then you come back and tell the Congress what we're going to do. I mean, the two stark world views of nationalism and globalism come out so clearly in that exchange. I would encourage you to Google that and watch it. Here's a quote from Bill Ayers. Now, who is Bill Ayers? Basically, Bill Ayers became popular because of his connection with Barack Obama when Obama was running for president in his first time around. And the claim of fame, or infamous claim, of Bill Ayers is that he and his wife, Bernadine Dorn, were very active in what's called the New Left or the Weather Underground. And they actually set off bombs in the Capitol, the Pentagon, and New York City Police Headquarters, I believe. And he was able to escape the long arm of justice through legal technicalities, and so he gave up his life and career as a domestic terrorist. So what does an ex-domestic terrorist do with his life? Well, he becomes a college professor, of course. I mean, what better way to carry on the revolution than to teach it to young minds, right? And this is what he says. This is from a recent speech he gave in Oregon on the subject of teaching and organizing for social justice. He says the great challenge for our generation is to think differently about what citizenship means, to think about what it means to be a citizen of the world. And he goes on and he says the American empire is in decline, the game is over, now what? And there are so many of these quotes that I could produce, but it shows you that the people in the culture and in the world that have the influence really do not think in nationalistic terms. They think in globalist terms, and that's why so many of their decisions seem strange to us and baffling. Let me take you to a second trend. What is the number one domestic enemy of the United States of America? Is it ISIS? I would argue it's the American public school system. And I know there are very good people. I have members of my family involved in public education. I know very well that there are good people in it. I'm talking about a philosophy that is controlling it. Abraham Lincoln said the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next generation. And the humanists figured that out. And they set out a long time ago to take over public schools. This is something a humanist said all the way back in 1930. He says, education is thus a most powerful ally of humanism, and every public school is a school of humanism. What can the theistic Sunday school teachers meeting for 1 hour a week and teaching only a fraction of the children do to stem the tide of a 5-day program of humanistic teaching? This is an interesting quote from a psychiatrist, Charles Pierce, speaking as an expert witness at an educational seminar in 1973. Look at this. Every child in America entering at the age of 5 is mentally ill. Why? Because he comes to school with certain allegiances to our founding fathers, toward our elected officials, and towards his parents, towards belief in a supernatural being, and towards the sovereignty of this nation as a separate entity. It's up to you as teachers to make these sick children well by creating the international child of the future. So children are mentally ill because they're too patriotic, among other things, and it's up to the school system to erase this mentality in them. Of course, you remember the Pledge of Allegiance in the good old days, right? Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Kirby Anderson reports in a 2007 newsletter that the Pledge of Allegiance has been changed in many school districts in Colorado. Here's the new version. I pledge allegiance to the flag and my constitutional rights from which it comes, and to the diversity in which our nation stands, one nation, part of one planet, with liberty, freedom, choice, got to throw that in there, and justice for all. I thought our Declaration of Independence mentioned the name God several times. I thought our rights came from God in this country. Well, if our rights come from God, then no one can take them away, right? That's what we call inalienable rights or unalienable rights. But if we fall for this idea that our rights come from government, then what the government giveth, the government can take away, right? And so a whole generation is being almost brainwashed into being talked out of this concept of unalienable rights. And then we throw into the mix multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is the idea that all cultures are equal. Now, in a multiculturalist paradigm, everything that's wrong with America, which there are things wrong with it, of course, it's not a perfect country, but those things are put under a magnifying glass. And everything that's special about our culture, everything that is unique about our culture is suppressed. And out the window goes the whole subject of American exceptionalism. Today it's considered racist or bigoted to talk about American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism meaning that America offers something to the world that you can find in no other country. Our own president doesn't believe in American exceptionalism. He says, I believe in American exceptionalism just as I suspect the Brits believe in British exceptionalism. And the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism. And so patriotism and loyalty to country is over and over again maligned or attacked in a multiculturalist paradigm. Brock Chisholm, who was the first leader of the World Health Organization, says this: to achieve world government, it is necessary to remove from the minds of men their individualism, their loyalty to family, tradition, and national patriotism, and religious dogmas. So we've got to expunge this idea of patriotism from the young mind, and that's the purpose of the school system. And by the way, in their thinking, your kids don't belong to you. This is a quote from Melissa Harris Perry, who's a political science professor and an MSNBC contributor. She said not too long ago, we have never invested as much in public education as we should because we've always had kind of a private notion of children. Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Now, I would challenge people to compare that statement to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verses 6 and 7, the great Hebrew Shema. And Moses was around a lot earlier than Melissa Harris Perry. And in 1406, he basically explains on the plains of Moab, these are the words which I command you today, shall be on your heart. You shall teach them to your children, to your sons. You shall talk about them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. The biblical worldview is that our children belong to us, not some overarching government. Well, there's a third trend that I believe is setting the stage for the world government of the future, and that's what I would call management by crisis. Here's how I'll define management by crisis. If you can convince people of the existence of a crisis of some sort, then they will voluntarily tolerate a surrender of their personal freedoms and resources to a government entity that promises to resolve the crisis for them. How did universal health care get passed in the United States of America most recently? Well, it's preceded by a long period of propaganda where we're told over and over again that there's a health care crisis in America. So if you want to tear down the greatest healthcare system in the world and rebuild it in the image of the post office or something like that, then you have to convince people that there's a crisis. And it's the same crisis related to Second Amendment rights. Every time there's a shooting or something like that, they want to give you this impression that there's this wild, wild west scenario out there. And the government needs to step in and solve this crisis on our behalf. And this is a strategy of big government people. Rahm Emanuel, who was chief of staff under Obama, said this: "We never let a serious crisis go to waste." What I mean by that is it's an opportunity to do things you could not do before. So we like a crisis, and in fact, in some cases, we'll create a crisis if that's what is necessary for the government to get bigger. And when you begin to understand the strategy, you begin to understand that this is employed over and over again at the international level. The United Nations is always promoting some kind of crisis, and they gravitate from crisis to crisis. For example, the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 was a crisis to protect the environment. The Human Rights Conference in Vienna in 1993 was another crisis to protect human rights. Then we have a population conference crisis in Cairo, Egypt in 1994 to prevent starvation and poverty. And then we have the Women's Conference in Beijing in 1995 to protect women's rights. Then we have the Habitat Conference in Istanbul in 1996 to provide global housing for all. And then the one that's very popular today is climate change. The Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen in 2009 to implement climate change policy. You know, it's what you see developing is what I would call a Chicken Little mindset. The sky is always falling. Now, I'm not saying that these aren't legitimate issues that we can work on together, but the fact of the matter is we need to start having more discernment concerning how these crises are used. They're always exaggerated or hyped, and world government is always the carrot that's dangled in front of everybody as the solution. The last one there, climate change, is very interesting to me because they used to call that global warming. And then suddenly they switched the vocabulary to climate change, probably because the scientific evidence for global warming wasn't what they wanted it to be. So we'll just shift the vocabulary and call it climate change, and that would cover warming and cooling and tsunamis and earthquakes and every other assorted thing that we can think of. John Kerry, the current Secretary of State, I believe, here is analogizing global warming or climate change to terrorism, epidemics, poverty, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Isn't it interesting how this keeps getting hyped over and over again? Why are they using this one? They're using this one because the environment affects everything, doesn't it? If you believe that there's global warming or climate change and things are catastrophic and these things are global in nature, we need a global solution, and that solution is world government. And so consequently, we have alphabet soup today. We have all this bewildering number of treaties and international bureaucracies which are designed to solve crises. And what's interesting about all of these things that I have listed there is they're all what we would call transnational. In other words, their accountability is not to one nation, but they govern spheres or multiple nations. Let me take you to a fourth trend that I believe is setting the stage for the coming world government of the future, and that's what's called the Gaia hypothesis. The Gaia hypothesis is this idea that the earth is not an inanimate object, but a living organism. The earth is a living, breathing, and thinking entity that we must be respectful to, or she, our mother, will retaliate against us through cold, heat, earthquakes, hurricanes, tsunamis, and so forth. And so it's very common to ascribe to the earth today living attributes. The earth has a fever, we're told. We're constantly being told about Mother Earth. Now, when we study Romans 1, verses 22 through 23, that's the very thing that Paul condemned, worshiping the created thing above the Creator. But notice some of these quotes from Gaia people. According to the Gaia hypothesis, we are part of a greater whole. If we endanger her, she will dispense with us in the interests of higher life. Here's another one. Gaia is not a tolerant mother. She is rigid and inflexible and ruthless in the destruction of whoever transgresses. At the popular level, you have to watch these actors and actresses very carefully. Here's Danny Glover. I've enjoyed a lot of his movies, but he said something that was astounding to me. He's making this statement in light of the Haiti earthquake of around 2010. And what he is saying is what happened in Haiti could happen anywhere in the Caribbean because all of these island nations are in peril because of global warming. When we see what we did at the climate summit in Copenhagen, this is the response. This is what happens. You know what I'm saying. Now, I'm not sure, Danny, if I know exactly what you're saying, but I think what he's saying is we did not adopt earth-friendly policies in Copenhagen, and the earth got mad at us and retaliated through an earthquake. That's essentially what he's talking about. That is classic Gaia. And consequently, if we understand that almost everything we do relates to the earth, you know, what we drink, where we work, what we drive, what we eat, any number of things, the kind of hairspray we use. I mean, all of that is environmentally affected, isn't it? If we begin to buy into this idea that we have to be kind to the earth or the earth will retaliate against us, then that is setting the stage for a massive rollout of government, not just in our own country, but around the world as well. And so consequently, Al Gore, in his book, Earth in the Balance, says very clearly, we must make the rescue of the environment the central organizing principle for civilization. And here is a couple of Gaia advocates. They said this: in searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea of pollution. The threat of global warming, water shortages, famines, and the like would fit the bill. In other words, we need a global crisis of some sort to bring in global government, and the environmental concept works very well. Let me give you a fifth trend that I believe is setting the stage for world government, and that would be the trashing or marginalization of the United States Constitution. If our Constitution stands for anything, it stands for limited government. Did you know that if you were to go home and read the Constitution, it would only span 11 pages, including the Bill of Rights? Obamacare is 3,000 pages. And in fact, it was Nancy Pelosi that said we've got to pass this so we can read it and find out what's in it, kind of thing. The Constitution gives to the national government 20 powers, and that's it. And today you can see that the government is involved in almost everything. And the Constitution is a deliberate shackle on big government. Thomas Jefferson said, in questions of power then, let no more be heard of the confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. So if that document stands for limited government, and if your goal is to bring in maximum global government, then that document has to be trashed and disparaged repeatedly. Some examples of this. Here is Ezra Klein, an MSNBC contributor. He says, the issue with the Constitution is that the text is confusing because it was written more than 100 years ago. And what people believe it says differs from person to person, depending on what they want to get done. What he's saying here is the Constitution can't be understood, because it was written 100 years ago. And what dum-dums we must look like at a conference like this, going back to the Bible, written in a different language and a culture, written 2,000 years ago. Or all the way back to 1446 BC, taking into consideration the writings of Moses. But this is what you call postmodern deconstructionism, where original intent is unknowable. Or people say the Constitution is flawed. Obama said this very clearly before he was elected. Obama described the U.S. Constitution as having deep flaws during a September 2001 Chicago Public Radio program, adding that the country's founding fathers had an enormous blind spot when they wrote it. Obama also remarked that the Constitution reflected the fundamental flaws of the country that continue to this day. Are you telling me that the documents that have given more people more economic and political freedom than any other document in human history is flawed? Even if it is flawed, it's been amended multiple times to get rid of the flaws. Or we have this kind of scenario where government officials don't even want to follow the Constitution. Obama says this: I urge this Congress to pursue a bipartisan market-based solution to climate change. But if Congress won't act soon to protect future generations, I will. I will direct my cabinet to come up with executive actions that we can take now. And this just happened a few weeks ago, didn't it? Through Shamnesty or amnesty, whichever name you want to use. Now, you may think that allowing 5 million people illegally into the country is a good thing, and we can have that debate sometime if you want to. But what I want to call your attention to is how it happened. It happened with the President of the United States making up law out of thin air. And people say, well, wait a minute, Reagan did it and Bush did it. Yeah, I wasn't happy when they did it either, but at least they did it based on a statute. This did not happen this time around. The last time I checked, I thought it was the executive branch that enforces the law and the legislative branch that passes the law, and the judicial branch which interprets the law. And what is happening now is it's just totally being discarded. And so we're living in this time period where the Constitution is perpetually maligned. If you Google the case Lawrence versus Texas, you'll see the United States Supreme Court reaching a ruling not based on our own Constitution and our own history and our own traditions, but rather based on global opinion. So the Supreme Court many times does not look at our own Constitution when trying to make a decision. They look at pervading global opinion. Again, another example of the total trashing over and over again of the United States Constitution. Robert Bork, who was an originalist before he died, wrote a wonderful expose of this in a book called Coercing Virtue, the Worldwide Rule of Judges. Yet another trend that I believe that is setting the stage for the coming world government of the future is what is called the International Criminal Court. Let me quote to you just a little excerpt from Dick Morris. He writes, "The United Nations Organized International Criminal Court creates universal jurisdiction throughout the world to prosecute international crimes such as genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, aggression, human rights violations, economic and environmental infractions, and treaty infractions." It all sounds so good on the surface, doesn't it? In the courts battling to gain worldwide acceptance, already 120 countries have signed on to the court, and 32 others recognize its jurisdiction but have not ratified it. Until the court can claim jurisdiction over the United States, Russia, and China, it cannot hold sway over the whole world. Fortunately, none of the big three have yet signed on. But this concept of this sort of court that has universal jurisdiction throughout the world to prosecute things that I would argue are very ambiguous. I mean, what does some of this language even mean? Treaty infractions, environmental infractions, aggression. Does that mean what George Bush did with Iraq and so forth? Is that a violation? And so consequently, you have this very ambiguous language, and this court is sort of unleashed to enforce things that no one really has a very clear definition of. One of the very important things to understand is our Constitution, and here in the United States of America, arose out of a basic Judeo-Christian worldview. Donald Lutz, in a book called The Origins of American Constitutionalism, does a study, and he takes a look at all of the things our founding fathers cited, and he found that over 34% of their citations in their writings come from the Scripture. Calvin Coolidge, July 5th, 1926, 4th of July weekend, made a very interesting statement. He says, "The principles which went into the Declaration of Independence are found in the sermons of the early colonial clergy. They preached equality because they believed in the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. They justified freedom by the text that we are all created in the divine image." Because there was biblicism, they had this idea that all people have dignity and worth and rights because they are image bearers of God. And consequently, the American system which arose out of that is largely a reflection of it. That's why the name God is cited over and over again in the Declaration of Independence. But you see, the International Criminal Court does not come from that same heritage. And so consequently, many of the rights that we take for granted are absent from the International Criminal Court. Burden of proof on the prosecution. Presumption of innocence. Right to an impartial jury trial. Right to a speedy trial. You just take someone, you jail them, and you leave them there until the prosecutor is darn ready to prosecute the case. Right to an appeal. In other words, if you lose at the International Criminal Court, who do you appeal to? Protection against double jeopardy. Double jeopardy is the idea that you can't be tried twice for the same offense. But at the International Criminal Court, if the prosecutor loses, he just keeps bringing the case over and over again until he wins. Freedom from self-incrimination. Protection against cruel and unusual punishment. So I do believe that we need to watch that International Criminal Court very carefully, because I look at that as a stage-setting device. A seventh trend that I'll draw your attention to is regionalism. Regionalism is the idea that you take a group of nations that are similarly situated geographically, and you kind of group them together. So the authority then is no longer those individual nations, but some kind of supranational structure imposed over them. I would argue that that's the very thing that's been happening in Europe for many decades, where the tiny nation states are no longer the places where true decisions are made. Those are just debating societies. The real power would reside in Brussels or someplace like that. That's what you call regionalism. Jerome Corsi wrote a very good book on this called The Late Great USA. Some people have criticized his work. I read it and I thought it was very compelling what he was talking about. He was talking about a region that's developing in North America called the North American Union, which will be a merger of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. No longer will you have three currencies over those three countries, but you'll have one currency called the Amero. Let me ask you a question. Do the immigration policies of America make any sense? Why is it that when I take a domestic flight in the United States, I have to pass through metal detectors and the like, and yet 1,200 people cross the border illegally? They cross the Rio Grande illegally. Why is it that we have porous borders, but we're frisking little old ladies when they're trying to fly to see their grandkids? I mean, that makes no sense unless the elites have already figured out something, that they're already looking at these three countries as a giant region. Then all of a sudden what they're doing makes perfect sense. That way, the border between America and Mexico is somewhat irrelevant, isn't it? If you've already ascertained that you're going to conglomerate into a single region. And what I believe, and I know not everybody in here will believe this, but I think Dr. Fruchtenbaum takes this view that eventually what you're going to have is 10 regions throughout the world. You'll have one in Europe, you'll have one in North America, and there'll be 10 of these developing. And then they will be conglomerated into a single world government. So regionalism is a prerequisite for globalism. Regionalism is step one, globalism is the end game. And another trend, number 8, that is setting the stage for world government is what I'll call unmanageable debt. Debt that is so high, there is no conceivable way it can be paid back. And I noticed even in the last election, I kept waiting with bated breath for one of these conservatives that were running for office to start talking about the national debt. They didn't talk about it. So our national debt is probably around closing $18 trillion. I read something recently where by the time Barack Obama leaves the White House, we will be $21 billion, something like that, in debt. How do you even conceptualize a number that high? This is a tool that Chuck Missler used in the current event session a few years ago. But he talked about a $100 bill. And then you stack up these $100 bills so they equal about $10,000, and that's what $10,000 looks like. And you keep stacking, and that's what $1 million looks like. And you keep stacking, and that's what $100 million looks like, about the size of a man. And if your eyes are good, you can see that original $100 bill down there at the bottom. Well, let's just keep on stacking. That's what $1 billion looks like. And let's just keep on stacking, and that's what $1 trillion looks like. Now, here you can't even see the man anymore, and I don't even see that original $100 bill, and that's what $1 trillion looks like next to a truck. Here's another picture of it next to a giant airplane or a football field, and let's just keep on stacking. That's what $15 trillion looks like, which is about a little under, but that's about the size of our national debt. About half the size of the Statue of Liberty. And according to some economists, when you look at all of America's unfunded liabilities, it really comes out to $114.5 trillion. A stack of $100 bills that's higher than the former Twin Towers, higher than the Empire State Building. If your eyes are good, you can still see that airplane and that football field down there at the bottom. And you just see this running of the printing press. Now, I used to think all of these people are either stupid or crazy. And that's a legitimate option at this point. I mean, these people have just lost their minds. And I used to think that way. What is wrong with them? Oh, wait a minute. Maybe they know what they're doing more than we think. Maybe this whole thing is planned. I found a very interesting article in the Telegraph, and this is what it said. The UN wants a new global currency to replace the dollar. Oh, if that's your goal, then we need to debase the dollar. We need to devalue the dollar. The dollar should be replaced with a global currency, the United Nations has said, proposing the biggest overhaul of the world's monetary system since World War II. You look at it from the globalist perspective, and suddenly this massive running of the printing press starts to look intelligent, if that's what their end goal is. And I remember traveling abroad to Germany in the 80s, and to the Philippines, and then I remember traveling abroad again at the end of the 1990s, and then with Dr. Randall Price and his ministry, we went to Israel. So I traveled abroad again recently in June, and one of the things that's shocking is how little value the dollar has. It's a psychological adjustment, because I remember living like a king no matter where I went because of the value of the dollar. By the way, if your doctor says you're as healthy as a dollar, you better get worried. And it's sort of a shock to the system to go to look at the exchange rates and see how little the dollar is able to purchase compared to what it was once able to purchase. Behind the scenes here, I'm starting to become more and more convinced of something called the Cloward and Piven strategy. Cloward and Piven are a husband and wife team, political scientists. They articulated this philosophy in various academic journals. And the Cloward and Piven strategy is basically a political strategy to overload the public welfare system to the point that it creates a crisis. Remember what Rahm Emanuel said? We never let a crisis go to waste. Creates a crisis and bankrupts the nation, leaving the country no choice but to adopt a socialist, communist, or I would even say a globalist agenda. There is a ninth strategy or stage-setting event that I believe is setting the stage for the world government of the future, and that's what I would call the new technology. What is the new technology? It's all of these gadgets and devices that we love because they're so convenient. The internet, podcasts, smartphones, cell phones, iPads, FaceTime, Skype, search engines, and apps. In fact, after this session is over, just do a little observation in the hallway or outside and watch how many people will be immediately on these devices, checking messages, looking at texts, and so forth. Now, where does all of this information go? Does it just sort of disappear into thin air? Quite the contrary, it's stored somewhere. Here's an article from The Guardian. Now this is a location called Bluffdale, Utah. Welcome to the Utah Data Center, a new home for NASA's exponentially expanding information trove. The $1.7 billion facility, 2 years in the making, will soon host supercomputers to store gargantuan quantities of data from emails, phone calls, Google searches, and other sources. Since January 2011, a reported 10,000 laborers have built 4 25,000 square foot halls filled with servers and cables, plus an additional 900,000 square feet of space for technical support and administration. James Bamford, author of The Shadow Factory, said the public had yet to grasp the significance of Utah's data mining. It's basically a hard drive. It's also a cloud, a warehouse. It'll be storing not just text and audio, but pictures and video. There is a lackadaisical attitude towards this. People pay no attention until it's too late. So all of our Google searches are stored somewhere. All of our emails are stored somewhere. Now, I'm not going to get paranoid about it because I love email and Google just like you. And I'm not sure that this storage facility is necessarily has evil intentions. Maybe it does. But what I'm saying is the technology is in place for that technology one day to fall into the wrong hands. Should the wrong ruler arise and begin to call for a surveillance society. Revelation 13, 16 through 18, you all know the verses well. He causes all, the small and the great and the rich and the poor and the freeman and the slave, to be given a mark on their right hand or their forehead, and he provides that no one will be able to buy or to sell except the one that has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here's wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for the number is that of a man, and his number is 666. Prophecy like that 100 years ago seemed crazy in terms of its fulfillment. But now with this new technology, we're living in a general period of time where we can see, oh my gosh, looks to me like a stage-setting device. I don't think what's going on in Utah is the mark of the beast, but it's a potential stage setter. Beyond that, how many times are you on camera every single day? You think about taking a trip to the bank, you're on camera. You go into a convenience store, as these looters in Ferguson found out. You're on camera again. You stop at a stoplight, you're on camera again. I read somewhere where in the United Kingdom, And this is a 10-year-old statistic. I don't even have the modern statistic. But in the United Kingdom, you're on camera 300 times every single day. And all of that data is constantly being stored, and this is preparatory for the one world system that is on the horizon. You have to understand the Satan is not omniscient. He doesn't know everything, and he's not omnipresent. So he has to have some kind of tool by which to keep track of the masses. And I think that we're seeing history finally catch up with where the Bible said things would go. The last trend that I'll call your attention to is the spiritual ecumenism. And one of the things to understand is that the Antichrist kingdom of the future will not just be political and economic. What I've given you up here thus far are all political and economic concepts, but it will be religious. 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 4 says this of the Antichrist: he opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. The system that is coming will be not just a one-world system of economics and politics, but it will be a system of religion. That, I believe, is what Nimrod was controlling at Babel. Because from Babel also came a religious system that was exported throughout the world called the mother-child cult. And the system was economic, it was political and religious, and that in essence is what Satan wants to bring back. The problem, though, for the globalist is how do you take all of the religions of the world, whether it be Islam, Buddhism, Mormonism, Christianity, Roman Catholicism, humanism, how do you put it all into one package? That's always been the troubling thing for the globalists. This is Charles Schleicher articulated this problem back in 1953. He observed there are those who believe that only a universal religion to which men are fervently devoted, one which unites men in devotion to a single God and in a common brotherhood, will serve to overcome the divisions among men and the worship of the secular nation-state. Notice that he calls the nation-state, which God established at Babel, he calls that idolatry. And he says the problem is the nation-state. Beyond that, the problem is all of these different religions. You can't have a world government of the future until you have a single religion. And so for years, we've kind of scratched our heads. How is all of this going to happen? Well, it all changed, I believe, with the coming of the New Age movement in the 1980s. Because you see, the New Age movement says everybody gets to God through their own path. Everybody is evolving into deity. If you want to take the atheist route, the humanist route, the Christian route, the Islamic route, the Buddhist route, then you just go right ahead. But don't say that your route's the only way. That's why we are always out of sorts with the New Age movement. And I believe that furnishes the quilt or the tapestry through which the coming world religion will thrive. Let me introduce you to the greatest spiritual leader in the world today, Oprah Winfrey. And I say that because she has a vast audience. And she's talking about a lot more than weight loss tips and cooking tips and recipes. Look at what she says, and you can find this on YouTube. She's interacting with an audience member. She says, one of the mistakes that human beings make is believing that there is only one way. She goes on and she says, there are many ways, many paths to what you call God. It doesn't matter whether she called it God along the way or not. There couldn't possibly be just one way. There couldn't be only one way with the millions of people in the world. She goes on and she asks, you are in some remote part of the earth and you never heard the name Jesus? Are you telling me that you cannot get to heaven? ? That is a pluralistic worldview that comes out of her. One of the things that's interesting about Oprah Winfrey is almost everything she touches or everything that she puts her endorsement on becomes a mega hit. Rhonda, I forgot her last name, Bernie's book, The Secret, a New Age book. That book had no traction at all until Oprah endorsed it, and now it becomes this runaway bestseller. And this is the mindset of the New Age movement. It's alive and well. One of the things that's always been difficult to understand is, okay, assuming that this one world religion comes into existence before the rapture, how are you going to pull evangelical Christianity into it? Certainly evangelical Christianity itself could never be pulled into the global religion of the future, could it? But what is the mindset of the evangelical church? It is ecumenical. It is constantly an urge to merge. And in the 1990s, we had evangelicals and Catholics together. Chuck Colson was a signatory to that. And this movement essentially said, all that stuff about faith alone and Christ alone and grace alone and Scripture alone, sola fide, sola gratia, sola Christus, and all of the other solas, sola Deo Gloria, to the glory of God. Let's just pretend that stuff doesn't exist anymore. Let's just pretend the Protestant Reformation never happened. And let's all come together to fight some kind of common enemy. And let's not evangelize one another's faults anymore. And that's a startling development in the 90s with evangelicals and Catholics together. And it's only accelerating through what is called the emergent church. Robert Weber, an emergent church author, says a goal for evangelicals in the postmodern world is to accept diversity as a historical reality, but to seek unity in the midst of it. This perspective will allow us to see the Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant churches as all forms of the true church, all based on apostolic teaching and authority, finding common ground. You should memorize those words because you're going to hear about them more and more as we get closer to the end. Common ground in the faith expressed by classical Christianity. Let's just pick 4 or 5 hills to die on. Let's pick the virgin birth, let's pick the Trinity, and let's pick a few other big ticket items. And let's unify around all that. All this stuff about a rapture, premillennialism, let's just kind of put that stuff to the back of the bus. And that is the mentality of the emergent church. This urge to merge, this ecumenical mindset, you even see it being spoken of by evangelical leaders. Now, did you ever think you'd ever see the day where Chrislam would exist? The first Chrislamic congregation, this billboard says. Google Chrislam. And it's amazing the number of people that think you can take the principles of Islam and the principles of Christianity and merge them together. 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 14 says, "Do not be bound together with unbelievers. For what partnership have righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship hath light with darkness?" And you know the rest of the verse. But these are trends that are even happening amongst us in our own numbers. ECT, evangelicals and Catholics together. Chrislam and the emergent church. So I believe the world religion of the future is even being set up today in preparatory form. Now, all of these things that I've gone through are not fulfillments of prophecies, but these are stage-setting events. I know you're depressed. I'm depressed. But I want to end with just a couple of seconds here on a happy note. There's actually a silver lining in all of this. The good news is simply this, that the coming kingdom of the Antichrist is temporary. Revelation 13 and verse 5 indicates that it will only last 42 months. Revelation 18 verse 10 says this kingdom will topple in a single hour. And what we have to keep in mind is there's coming a stone cut without human hands, which is, I would understand, is the kingdom of God. It will shatter the 10 regions of the Antichrist, the feet of iron and clay, and the whole statue will just crumble, Daniel 2 says. And then that stone cut without human hands will grow and grow and grow and grow till it fills the whole earth. The Antichrist kingdom is temporary. God's kingdom is forever. Isaiah 9 and verse 7 says, there will be no end to the increase of his government. Think of a government of peace where there is no end to it. And that time period will be characterized by Jerusalem as the center of world spiritual and political authority. Not Washington, D.C., praise God. Perfect justice, world peace, even the animal kingdom. There'll be peace in the animal kingdom. Wolf and lamb will lie down together. I was at the Houston Zoo the other day. I noticed wolf and lamb were in different cages, not in the same cage. And universal spiritual knowledge. This is the only new world order that I want to be part of. And you see, our message to people is this whole thing is crumbling fast. And we need to tell people that they can switch their allegiance from one kingdom to the next through personal faith in Jesus Christ. And I would encourage you to work this into your evangelism, because the world itself is nervous about these things. They see these horrific trends happening, and we're the ones that have the answers to it. So I've tried to give you a point of view on globalism. We looked at the divine perspective on globalism. God is against it. Genesis 11. Satan is seeking and working in history to set up globalism. He can't quite do it now because of the presence of the restrainer. And yet, Roman numeral 3, there are very clear trends that are taking place in our world that are setting the stage for world government. And then finally, number 4, world government will come, but world government will go. And it will be eclipsed by the glorious reign of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Thank you, Andy. Don't worry, it's going to get worse later in the conference. Someone texted me a picture called Full Preterist Christian Church, Bible Institute of Learning in the heart of Texas somewhere. Well, so interesting. Now, is this being fulfilled today, Andy?
No. Stage setting.
Okay.
Don't give the microphone to that guy over there. Give it to somebody else.
Andy, thanks for your presentation. Excellent. We see these trends where it's ultimately headed. With the recent election, it seems like a window has opened up. We can't stop it, but can we slow it down? Is that an assessment? Is that right?
I personally believe that is correct, because we're to be good stewards while we're here. We're to occupy till he comes. And let me give a little fact that most people don't know. I've heard Tim LaHaye talk about it. Who has done more to promote dispensational eschatology than Tim LaHaye recently? Probably no one, in terms of getting it into the mind of the common man. It's Tim LaHaye, if I have the story right, that gave Jerry Falwell the idea for the moral majority. And see, what people like to do is they like to say, oh, you guys are just sitting around waiting for everything to fall apart, when in reality, that's one of the points I use to blunt that argument. So we are to have a role. I don't think we can reverse things, but we can thwart the progress of evil. I saw this recent election as an outworking of that. Did you know that of every 3 voters in this last election, 1 of every 3 was a values Bible voter? And they went and supported the Republican Party 7-1. I don't think they're in love with the Republican Party, but they went out and voted for what they felt was the opposition to the fundamental transformation of America. And so I think we do have some kind of role to play.
This mic is on. Okay. There are, as you have brought up in your talk, which is excellent, I appreciate it, many points of conflict. But there's a major point of conflict in my mind, and maybe all of you know about this. I've been wanting to ask Tommy Ice and Tim LaHaye this for some time. Can you point me to a book or something that I ought to look at? Jesus said that we are to pray for our enemies. And this is one of the most difficult things I have to do. I was talking about Obama being a communist before the first election, and it's very difficult for me to get my hands around how am I going to pray and what should I pray. So can you point me towards some appropriate resources that would have a godly perspective on what Jesus commanded us to do? Pray for your enemies, because we've got a lot of them.
Well, I tried that during the Clinton administration, but it didn't help any. Just kidding. But go ahead.
Well, I would say the godly resources I would point to is the book of Proverbs, because it says in the book of Proverbs that the king's heart is like water in a water course. Just as a water course directs water, the king's heart is in the hands of God, and he directs it wherever he wants. And I would also point you to the book of Isaiah, chapter 45 and verse 4, where Cyrus was used strategically by God to release the nation, Judah, from the 70-year captivity. And Isaiah 45 and verse 4 specifically says that Cyrus did not know God. So what I'm trying to say is it doesn't matter if Obama or whoever is in the White House, we can pray that God will work in spite of them. And I think the Bible has many examples of that.
Yeah, and 1 Timothy 2 says we're to pray for people or leaders for salvation, that they can get saved.
Andy, I really appreciate your message. That's probably the most stimulating thing I've heard in a long, long time. And it fits in with my understanding of prophecy and my great love for America. And I'd like to ask you this question. First of all, let me just say I believe that the recent election gives me hope that there may be the possibility that God yet has plans to use America. But how do you equate all of the corruption in our country and the realization of the very things you've been talking about worldwide in the light of America keeping the promise of God to Abraham in Genesis 12:3, 1-3, that has never been revoked? And do you agree that if the primary issue today in America is that we keep our federal government from throwing Israel under the bus?
My answer to that is absolutely, because I believe very strongly in Genesis 12, verse 3. Whoever curses the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will be cursed. Whoever blesses them will be blessed. In my own private thinking, I think that's one of the last things that's keeping God's hand on this country. And I believe that, God forbid, should that go in our lifetime, we know it's got to go at some point, because Zechariah says all the nations will be against Israel. But that doesn't mean it has to happen in our lifetime. I believe if that abandonment of Israel should happen in our lifetime, we will quickly become a third world nation almost overnight. We'll be under the curse.
I think it'll change quickly after the rapture.
Yeah.
I would just like to challenge this group. Tim LaHaye has a name, and it has power. And he has been asking this group for at least 3 years that I know of to pray for his movie that he'd like to produce. Now, he has a script, he has everything, except he doesn't have the opportunity. And I would like you to do what I and my church have been doing for this past year. Pray for God to bring that about, because I believe it could bring a great revival to this nation. Because if you see the resurrection in power, it will be convicting.
Yeah.
Amen. I wish I could get those secularist, brainwashed people in Hollywood to understand that. want to express my appreciation to all the folks here who have prayed every year. We've talked about this. This has been in my passionate dream for at least 8 years. We have the best script ever written on the resurrection with evangelistic appeal. But the 2% of the population that doesn't share the same love for the Lord and for marriage as God created it have been fighting me every step of the way. And only God can make it come to pass. But I have the gut feeling that in my lifetime it's going to happen. And that should be very soon.
Well, if it's going to happen in your lifetime, it better be soon, right? So you're saying you haven't gotten there yet. Right, he hadn't gotten there yet. But his idea is to have a movie that starts with the resurrection, with flashbacks, and ends with the ascension to prepare for another movie dealing with Bible prophecy. And I think that's a tremendous idea that would be very good. Any other questions or comments? Well, if not,